describe for people who don't know, who have no idea about Mississippi, when you came into Mississippi, describe the place you were coming into, the things that you were confronting as a civil rights worker in Mississippi at that time.
Okay, well, you know, I'd already seen it, so it wasn't anything new.
Okay, one more. You might say, I see, I've already seen it.
I already seen it when I got to Mississippi. I'd seen it. I'd already seen it, so it wasn't anything new. I'd seen it in Maryland here. I'd seen it in Virginia, so it wasn't anything new. And I'd seen it on television.
Okay. When you say it wasn't something new, what are you talking about? What was it new? And
I mean, the reaction of whites against what they considered to be an infraction on their status quo. Mm-hmm. So I'd seen the reaction. I had known it, and even if I had not known it, I'd known enough people in SNCC who worked in the Deep South who had seen it. So I knew exactly what to expect. I'd been already in the nonviolent campaigns. I'd been arrested several times before. So it wasn't something shocking. The intensity and the rage, of course, was it was more intense than elsewhere, but it was the same thing. I can remember when we came in from New Orleans, I saw she had to be at least 76 years old, a 76-year-old white lady with a cane raised, and she was trembling with rage, trying to hit me. And I was more worried about her dying of a heart attack than trying to hit me. You know what I mean? I'd never seen it in such intensity, you know. They spat at us, oh, yeah, it was really wild, you know. But I'd seen it on television before, so I knew exactly what to expect, you know.
Okay. Why concentrate, why SNCC concentrating so hard on Mississippi? What was it about Mississippi that became an important focus for the movement, especially for SNCC at that time? Say in and we're talking 62, 63 now.
It was the enemy's stronghold. It was the enemy's stronghold. Here's where the laws of segregation and the exploitation of the African masses were more strictly enforced than anywhere else in the country. Consequently, once you break this, everything else is finished. Others had a different idea of taking on these little ones step by step, but we said no. Hit him in Mississippi, finish him, and you finish all the others. Let's go.
Okay. When you refer to black people, use a term that we understand from them. Audience, I know.
That one's going to be difficult for me.
I know it's very difficult.
Yeah, stop on that one.
You know, you not know. Think about the people we're talking to. You're talking to me right now, but there are people who watch this who have very simple, really a very simple understanding. So tell me, the vote, Mississippi. Why are we moving toward? Why has the vote become the strategy? Why is this something that we realize is target?
Well, I think, you know, the people could see on their daily lives the relationship of the vote to the political subjugation which they were forced to endure. Since they had no political power, they couldn't get their streets paved. They had nothing to say about the type of school their children went to. They had absolutely nothing to say about the taxes. I mean, they had absolutely nothing to say about anything that affected their lives. Consequently, they instinctively knew that this fight on the political front would be the fight that would come to better the conditions in which they lived. So instinctively, they could see the necessity of the vote. And everybody who had responsibilities to education, to having their roads paved, etc., while not everybody even cared to go and eat at a white hamburger stand, even if they had the money to.
Now tell me about the other side. To those who had the power, what did black vote mean? What did it mean? And then how was that translated in terms of keeping black people from having the right to vote?
Well, it would mean for those who were oppressing Africans there, it would mean that they would have to lose a lot of economic benefits and economic profits. Consequently, they had to struggle for their very economic life to ensure that there were no changes in the political status quo.
Okay. Let's cut 1 second, please. Okay. Talk to me about this. And what does this mean, this thing of taking power? We're talking about power now in Mississippi. Help me to understand that.
Well, if you're talking about here, loss of economic profits ill-gotten through a fight on the political front, then you're speaking seriously of a struggle to the death. Of course, anyone knowing at that time just the history of Mississippi knew precisely what you're up against. We had seen Medgar Evers get shot in Mississippi just for encouraging people to vote, in cold-blooded. And we saw that when the man who killed him was brought up to the court, he was let scot-free. He walked right out the court. He wasn't even arrested, as a matter of fact. So it was clear to everybody what was going on. We had seen people's house burned down. We've seen people arrested for no reasons. All of us have been arrested. We've had houses shot at. We had houses burnt down. We were facing nothing less than naked white terrorism. And we properly understood this. If a few years ago, before we went to Mississippi, the picture of Emmett Till was strongly imprinted upon our mind. Emmett Till was a little child, I don't think no more than 13 years old, who whistled at a white girl, and he was killed and thrown in Tallahatchie. And all my life, all I wanted to do was to get into Tallahatchie County, and it was a terrorist county. It took years of work to get into Tallahatchie. They had people so intimidated. I mean, even I had to sneak in there late at night and come back out before the morning. Tallahatchie County. So all of this was in, but we came to crack it wide open, and nothing was going to stop us from doing that, no matter what it took, including our lives. That was already decided.
Okay, then with that in mind, describe the use of non-violence tactic in this? It was like an image of the movement. How did that apply in Mississippi then?
Well, it doesn't really apply. You see, the question of nonviolence does not apply when you take it. The question of nonviolence doesn't have any real relevance when you talk about organizing. Nonviolence as a tactic in a public demonstration is, at this point, effective. But if you're an organizer, you're talking about being on the road to 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, sneaking on a plantation with the Ku Klux Klan laying in wait for you. You come down the highway, they come chasing you. If you stop and be nonviolent, they're going to kill you. If you are dead, we need another worker to come to replace you to carry on the people's struggle. So the logics of this was just incomprehensible. That's why the people who were involved in organization instinctively understood that nonviolence was a tactic. And consequently, the tactical name of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee stayed there. But most organizers in the Deep South who worked for SNCC were carrying guns. And these contradictions were clear. I'm riding along in Mississippi. I'm sent to Cleveland, Mississippi to have a meeting and a discussion and do some work with a man called Amzie Moore, who was with the NAACP. Fine. I get in the car with Mr. Moore, we go. On the way back, I look at some cars and I see they look like they might be following us. And I say to Mr. Moore, I said, these cars might be following us. He said, don't worry about it. I said, they might be seriously following us. Don't worry about it. And he reaches under the seat of his car and pulls out a brown paper bag with a gun in it. I feel very safe now. I said, oh, you don't have to worry about anything about it. Just pass it here. You just keep on driving. Don't worry about anything. You know, so the logic of nonviolence is finished here. It's completely finished, yeah.
There was and I'm going to jump ahead now because there was a specific time when, after the murder, the 3 civil rights workers are found, that there is a discussion about using violence at a demonstration. You were there. It's actually in your district. Your people are talking about this. Mm-hmm. You are the one who really says, no, this is not what we can do right now. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that. What was that?
Well, it would not work exactly what we were doing. Number one, there's a difference between spontaneity and organization. Big difference. Of course, when you're organizing, you must use spontaneity. But merely because you're using spontaneity doesn't mean you're organizing. Our people can be mobilized very easily, but to keep them organized is a serious task. And we were laying the groundwork for organization in Mississippi. This spontaneous uprising, this spontaneous confrontation, not uprising, confrontation, this spontaneous confrontation would create problems for our organizing efforts. In the first place, people would be arrested. Resources which should be continued for the organizing, which is long range and more effective, will have to be disrupted. Attitudes will have to be changed. Those who are doing quiet work now will come under more fire from whites who will, through this confrontation, want to augment their revenge, you know. So in all aspects, it would disrupt the organizing efforts. It was simply a question between spontaneous activity versus the long haul for organization. And always in that discussion, I've always been against spontaneity, always for organization. Now, we understand there are times when the people rise up and you have no choice but to rise up with them. That's understood. But It was just a question, and that one had been worked out in SNCC long before, with a lot of struggle. It had been worked out, as a matter of fact, since the decision which was made between organizing and public demonstrations, public accommodation demonstrations. And so I went with organizing from the very beginning. I recognized the necessity for organizing above mobilizing the people.
Yes. And pick up
Really?
the Freedom Summer.
Mhm.
That there was the idea to bring white students into Mississippi to work with the organizers there. What were your feelings about that, and why did you feel that way?
Well, you know, I guess the probably best way you can term it was that inside of SNCC, there were nationalist forces and non-nationalist forces. That would probably be the best way to pose it. Now, SNCC in D.C., the Nonviolent Action Group, they were a strong nationalist base. You had, you know, Corton Cox coming out of places like New York with Harlem and strong nationalist background, myself also, and also having been born in the Caribbean, it means that our struggle here could not just be a struggle other than really deeply linked in nationalism. So you had strong nationalists. So there's a constant struggle inside of SNCC between the nationalist forces and, for lack of a better term, of course it's a vague term, the non-nationalist forces. And the Summer Project was opposed by the nationalist forces. And all of the problems which we outlined turned out to be absolutely correct. We had said, number one, that doing that would begin to give only a false hope to the people, one, because they would see all these things just for a summer, and once the summer was over, it'd be back to business as usual, and we could not sustain it, one. Secondly, it would push local people into the background completely and totally, and that they would no longer be in control of what would come because it would be too big for their capacities. And then here, you would have this staff, this cadre which we were developing, they would be retarded in their growth, again, only for the suffering of the people. There are many, many other points, but these are some of the points that we harped on. Of course, we were very strong about the point that we didn't also want a lot of white students to come down because we knew what would happen, and the atmosphere would change, and then once again, the African masses in Mississippi would think that they were saved by whites. So there were strong points, not just strategic points and tactical points, but strong ideological points here that really came to struggle. We opposed it completely.
Well, there were many people who felt that Mississippi needed to be opened up to the rest of the country, that the attention of the country needed to be drawn to Mississippi. What did you feel that this was a...
We were totally against that. For us here, the question...
You gotta tell me what you...
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting you now. There were some of those inside of the organization who felt that this would help open up Mississippi immediately. But we were not concerned with opening up Mississippi. We were concerned with the level of organizing power that our people had inside the state of Mississippi. And this was the different issue completely. So you could see there were really strong ideological struggles here. But as I said, the nationalist forces, we were completely defeated. We were the minority, and there was a vote, and we lost. But we were disciplined. We worked harder in the Mississippi Project than anybody else because we had a meeting. We said they're wrong. Let's show them we're wrong. Let's show them how wrong they are. Let us work harder on their project than they will and bring it quickly to its failure. And we worked harder than anybody else. And no one who works for SNCC can deny the fact that the nationalist forces were the hardest working forces in Mississippi in 1964 Summer Project because we knew it would be a failure and we worked to make it a failure. The 2nd Congressional District, into the area where most of us were gathered, was one of the best organized and had some of the most militant. That's, of course, not to our thanks. These people, not to our work. These people were there, but the encouragement, the vitality, the enthusiasm. Oh, yes, the 2nd Congressional District played a most militant role throughout the entire, all the way up through the MFDP.
There are those who say that by bringing in students to the summer, what you were doing was not only drawing the attention of the country to Mississippi, but what you were also doing was opening up local Mississippians to a chance to establish some relationship. Let's cut for a second. Okay, so let's talk to me about your feelings about the summer and what took place in your district and why.
Okay, we worked in the 2nd Congressional District. That's the Delta area. That's flatland. Here your work is to, because here you have your plantation strength. This is where the plantation system took its real roots. So here you're still talking about a legacy of a plantation system, a big white house with the shacks and what they call sharecropping, for all practical purposes slavery, because these peasants, Abraham Lincoln freed them, and he freed them without money. So the day he freed them, they were in debt, and they stayed in debt until the 1960s. So that means you had families who had lived on this plantation for a long time, or if not, were traded off by another white man, just like in slavery, because they were in debt. Because the minute they were freed, they came out of freedom, where could they go? They didn't have no money. So if they stayed on the plantation, the boss man said, okay, you can stay, but from now on you're free. You ain't got no food, you ain't got no rent. I'll lend it to you, and that's where it started, and that's where it was. Up until the 1960s, the system had not changed at all. We went straight from freedom into debt. I mean, we were slaves and we didn't need money, and we went into debt. The money never even touched our hands. And we were dead in debt. So you could understand the situation. You would have a plantation here with about houses with all these plantations, and you would have to go on the plantation and still have the system with the boss man, that is the slave driver, the overseer. He was still there, and he always had his gun on the truck. And of course, it's a capitalist country, so if you trespass on private property, you can be killed. So you've already got legal grounds to be killed, and in addition to this, you are what they consider to be a communist agitator, whom they want to kill anyway, so you're inviting death on legal grounds. So you can imagine that the use of white students here would be most impractical. You couldn't send them on a plantation together. What would an integration people be doing in a plantation? And this, you could only send groups here that were not integrated. You just have to send all African groups here. They would have to go onto the plantation system. The integrated groups couldn't do it. In our district, in the towns of Greenwood and Greenville, Greenwood because of hard work, and also Greenville because of hard work, plus a different type of atmosphere which they were trying to create in the state of Mississippi, we could use whites, and did use them inside of our district. Now, we must point out that there was a struggle inside of SNCC, as we said, about bringing down the white students, and we ourselves were in the corner of the nationalists against it. But we were clear that this contradiction which existed in SNCC should not go outside of SNCC, because we had a bigger enemy than we did inside of SNCC, these white terrorists. And if we were divided, these white terrorists would be advancing their cause to our peril. So we understood that this contradiction which we had must be remained inside the organization. So most white students who came and worked in our district could never say that they were treated hostile, or as if many of them didn't even know what occurred inside the discussion until after they had served and read about it in party files, etc., etc. Even those who worked in the second in Greenwood, Bob Zellner, who was white, was head of the project there, and others played roles in Greenville, etc., etc.
Now, when the three workers are missing and found dead, there are many people who then began to say that this is the only reason why they were brought into Mississippi anyway. They wanted to get some whites killed in Mississippi. What did you feel about that? Where were you with that?
Well, I made no remorse, no special remorse. I mean, I've been in Mississippi before, and I've seen Africans killed in Mississippi. So, you know, if I've seen African killed, seeing white killed does not upset me any more than to see African being killed. I'm just equally upset at a worker being killed. So this only had effect upon for the country, but for me, anybody can die for freedom. I had no.
You seem to have a very clear idea that to be engaged in a struggle like this means that
it meant death. There was no question. It meant death.
What meant death?
Working in the struggle meant death. There was no question here. Everybody knew that. It meant death. All you have to do is glance at the history of Mississippi. It meant absolutely death. I said there was nothing but naked terrorism working here. Nothing but that. It meant constant harassment by the police forces and by the forces of naked terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council. And sometimes, and all times, both were working together. Just different tactics at different times, but all used any tactic, anytime. A policeman can shoot you just as quickly as a Ku Klux Klansman could. So there was no question here. This was naked terrorism.
Now you were what, 22 years old by then? At this time?
No.
How old were you then?
Oh,
20 years old?
Yeah, I could be facing. When I first started facing, I was about 19. Well, it's all right. You go to war, you face the same thing.
Yes, but can you help me to understand or to get a feeling for your own? I mean, did you experience fear? Were you afraid? Did you deal with fear in terms of your people, the people who worked with you? How did you?
No, it's just a war, that's all. I mean, a soldier in war can't know fear. Bullets are flying everywhere. I mean, fear is just going to immobilize you. You're dead already. So, no. Here, there's no fear here. You're just in war. Bullets are flying. You're seeing other people die. Everybody knew Jimmy Travis got a shot in a car. In a car, did he? Yes. Well, I drove the same road because it's right outside of Greenwood. I work there, so any night I'm riding on the road, anybody can shoot me. So there's no fear here. I just have to learn to drive effectively so that when they chase me, I'll be able to dodge them and they will have run into a truck or run into a ditch or leave them in the smoke. There was no fear here. It was just clever response, survival instincts at its best.
Idea of the differences, okay, between the two sides, and where those differences and how those differences are going to lead us to a new approach and a new idea.
Okay, now we want to go back again and emphasize that the names we're giving to them is nationalist and non-nationalist, again for lack of better terms, more precise terms. And even, I guess at this time, if you're talking about this time, this would probably be the terms given at this time too.
Now, okay, in terms of nationalists and non-nationalists, you're talking about those who see the struggle of black people's struggle.
Exactly. Must lead it, must, and it depends.
Give it to me that way instead of nationalists and non-nationalists.
Okay. For those nationalist forces, then, they would see, number one here, the necessity of an independent organization for Africans in the country, one. Number two, that this organization must be led by them, financed by them, and ideologically controlled by them. Number three, that the vote then, for them, only became a tool, not a tool to continue, but a tool to organize the people. For them, it was the level of organization of the oppressed masses that would decide the question of victory. On the other side, you had what we would consider to be the non-nationalist forces. They felt here that coalition forces were necessary and just enough pressure was necessary to be brought upon the state of Mississippi to crack it open and make it part of America. There were others here who were screaming on the nationalist front that we're not trying to be part of America, we're trying to change all of America. You understand? And we're not just trying to make Mississippi become into part of America. Of course, some on the other side could not comprehend that. That's understandable. Even some who were shouting it on the nationalist side did not comprehend it. That too is understandable. So on the non-nationalist forces, you've had those who would see that publicity would be a method because all they want is to expose how dangerous and bad Mississippi is to the rest of the nation, and the conscience of the rest of the nation would quickly wake up and say, oh, we're doing terrible things, let's try and make it like Chicago. You understand? Our statement was clear. When you get the vote, the nationalists used to say all the time, when you get the vote, don't get excited, because they got the vote in Chicago and they're still poor and powerless. So there were those who then on the non-national side who felt just bringing them in, getting them the vote would solve the problems. This crystallized around the issue of joining the Democratic Party and not joining the Democratic Party. The nationalist forces did not want to join the Democratic Party. They wanted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to be an independent party, independent of the Democratic Party, and then to, from this party, build an independent party for Africans throughout America. Those in the non-nationalist forces felt that no, that they could get into the Democratic Party, and when they got in, everything would be all right. It'd just be like, I guess, Chicago and New York, So these were the real struggles. Now, even most of the nationalist forces, including myself, were against, what was being pushed, since, again, we were the minority. We pushed the program very hard. We worked very hard at the Atlantic City Convention. If you will look there, you will find us working very hard because we knew it wouldn't happen. And when the Democratic Party did reject the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, as we knew it would, and even the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, sirens, I got it. As we said, there were, all right, no problem. I got it. As we were saying, there were two forces inside of SNCC, and we crystallized around the point of Democratic Party. The non-nationalist forces felt that pressure from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, plus liberal pressure from throughout the country, Labor Union Church, the same coalition of King, even including King, would allow for them to enter into the Democratic Party. The nationalist forces felt that we didn't even want to get into the Democratic Party, that we had organized force, and this force should be used, should be spread to fight the Democratic Party from outside, not inside the party, where we would have our own control of how to use the party. This was the struggle. This was the class struggle, of course. As we said, the nationalist forces went and struggled at Atlantic City. Dr. King himself who was asked by SNCC, the non-nationalist forces, to come and help, took a position against the MFDP at the Democratic Convention, and they brought him out on crutches to try and change the minds of the people. So we cannot say that this decision which the people took, the MFDP took, was imposed upon them by the nationalist forces, because they brought out King, they brought out Bayard Rustin, they brought out Walter Reuther, they brought out Hubert Humphrey, they brought out every possible, the biggest political forces the Democratic Party had, and since they were going to be the winning party, they had all of them before the people, explaining to the people why they should accept this filthy compromise, and unanimously the MFDP said no. So they couldn't say that this was imposed by the nationalist forces. This was a decision of the people. So it showed here that the nationalist forces were properly in tune with the people's aspirations, and the non-nationalist forces were not.
Okay. Cut for a second.
That one is a kind of rough statement. I ended up with saying that.
What were the goals of the MFDP challenge for those from Mississippi as well as those organizing in Mississippi?
Okay. Again, we see through SNCC as two different goals. For the nationalist forces, the goal was the organization of the people, that organization which was built, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which belonged to the people, which they controlled, and which was a militant organization, which was uncompromising. And it had a network of poor people in it, so it really was a poor people's party and a really strong party. So for the non-nationalist forces, this was what we wanted. This was the goal. Now, we wanted to broaden this goal throughout the country. That's what the nationalist forces. So for them, the MFDP, the challenge and all that, was nothing other than a tactic to help make a strong party. For the non-nationalist forces, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party represented a solution. Number one, they assumed that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would be seated inside the Democratic Party and perhaps allow maybe Mrs. Hamer or Mr. Aaron Henry to run and become a senator or a congressman from the state of Mississippi. That's what they really believed. And of course, if you'd look, they had all the backing of liberal congressmen and senators who were speaking, and the atmosphere in the country at that time, et cetera, et cetera. So they really honestly believed that they were going to acquire this. The nationalist forces knew that there was no chance or no hope for this, that this would not happen. But since they honestly believed it, when the compromise was rejected, and they themselves had to reject it, you must understand it now, it's not even that they wanted it. The nationalist forces did not have to fight to tell the MFDP not to accept the compromise. The non-nationalist forces were telling them not to accept the compromise. They themselves were shocked at really what was given. So it meant that they themselves, coming with the hope of having the solution, having to deny the very solution which they gave in, were finished once the compromise had to be rejected. They had no new place to turn. They couldn't now say, let's go back again to the MFDP, even though they tried now with the congressional challenge. You understand? So, but it was just a continuation of something that had already been finished. The nationalist forces knew it. So for them, it was just a question of building a party.
So in the end, what did all this mean? What did this mean in terms of where the movement was going, in terms of Mississippi, in terms of black political involvement in the Democratic Party or in the national parties at all? What did all this mean?
In the end, it meant the only program that SNCC had was, in fact, the independent political party. But this minority force, which had it, had in the struggle, had become this minority force, which had the correct path, couldn't carry the weight of the majority force, which disagreed with this. Stop.
Yes. Okay. Let's stop.
I understand what I want to say. I know precisely. Okay. Let's go.
16. Now beat it for me. Second mark, 16.
Once the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party compromise was rejected by the MFDP, the non-nationalist forces had no further solution. It was only the nationalist forces that had the solution, an independent political party. The nationalist forces left the state of Mississippi completely to the non-nationalist forces. Here, of course, their only alternative to the people was to join the Democratic Party, work with the poverty program, and try to, or just leave the state themselves. The nationalist forces then went to concentrate in Alabama as a project, even though all of them didn't go to Alabama. Some went to Atlanta, some went elsewhere, but everyone was feeding in on the project, which we were trying, the small project just as a test case, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which became the Black Panther Party by its symbol. So consequently, this was the only alternative that SNCC had, and that's why the Black Panther Party, though it was only organized in one county in Alabama, had more noise in 1965 than Mississippi did with all the counties we had organized with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Thus, again, we showed that the nationalist forces were absolutely correct in their decisions to move that way. Of course, with the coming of this force to the fore, that is, the nationalist forces, it meant that the non-nationalist forces would fall out and then everybody would begin to attack the organization to destroy it because the organization was coming out to be something other than what those liberal forces had conceived it to be.
Okay. Now, with these two separate forces emerging, say, in Mississippi during the summer of '64, what did they represent? What were we seeing happening in SNCC at the time? What was emerging now? Right? And put it in the context of what we're seeing in '64 and things like that.
Actually, what you were seeing in '64 was the question of what should be the relationship to our people, to the Democratic Party, and to the political structure in America in general. Should they participate in the system with full faith in the system, or should they understand that the system has to be destroyed in order for them to be free? That's the question that was always coming to the fore. Of course, those who opted to participate inside the system have demonstrated, well, I'm sorry, we're going ahead of time. You said just to keep it there, yeah.
What I'm trying to get to is I want you to give me, okay, when you come into Selma in January, what do you encounter when you get there?
Well, there are many, many forces here. We must try very carefully to understand them. In the first place, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference have one conflict going on. Inside of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, I'm coming step by step. I'm coming step by step.
Now, tell me we're in
I'm
Selma.
coming.
Tell me that we're in Selma first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then tell me what this conflict is.
I'm so sorry. I thought yeah, okay, I forget, all right. After the Mississippi Challenge in Atlantic City, we come back to Mississippi. As we were saying, SNCC was in fact Mississippi, even though it had other projects outside of Mississippi, in Arkansas, in Maryland, in southwest Georgia, et cetera, even Atlanta, Georgia. But SNCC was Mississippi. Whatever Mississippi SNCC decided. The Waveland Conference then becomes the most important conference at this time for SNCC. Is at this Waveland Conference that decision is made for those who do no longer want to work within the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, heading in the Democratic Party, to find another area of work and demonstrate their alternative project. Here, many of us who were in positions, myself for example, resigned from the Mississippi staff and went to work for the Alabama staff to put the idea of independent party inside of Alabama Black Belt. Of course, SNCC had been working in projects in Alabama for years. Even while Mississippi SNCC was going on, Alabama SNCC was going on for years. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which used mobilization as its technique and method and not organization, would come into conflict with SNCC. The same conflict we spoke about in Mississippi that we just discussed there when they tried to have the demonstrations and I was against it is the same thing. The method of SELC was to come through to a town that was suffering under oppression, or rabble-rouse the town, agitate the town, bring out the town, bring the town together in mobilized activity to hit against levels of injustice. Here, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King, being one of the greatest mobilizers, played a crucial role. And so once you knew that Dr. King was coming to a town, that was it. That town was going to turn out. There was no question here. Well, you can understand some of the problems that SNCC would have. At this point, SNCC is becoming strong, known as an independent organization. It has its project going on in Alabama. It needs funds to keep that project going. So if its image is not projected in the press, it will not get the money it needs. This is not my problem, only an organizational problem. Of course, consequently, then becomes part of my problem. I may disagree with the approach that SNCC takes to solve the problem, but it is a problem. Martin Luther King will come in with SCLC into a project where SNCC was working. SCLC will get all of the credit, not only for the work done, but we project it and we'll get all the monies from outside. SNCC will get none. So James Foreman, whose task it is to see that we get funds, this is his biggest problem. You understand it. You must see the priority of problems we have. For me, this is not the biggest problem. It is, however, a problem for SNCC.
What is the biggest problem for you?
For me, the biggest problem is a political problem. Number one.
Camera frame at that point? Go ahead.
What is the biggest problem?
For me, the biggest problem is the political problem. That is, we have a project going. Martin Luther King is coming in anyway. We cannot stop him. So it doesn't make sense to fight him. See where we can use him and use him effectively for the organization and for our work. We cannot fight him. He's too powerful in the press. We cannot fight him. He's too well respected. We cannot fight him. When decisions are to be made, if he makes a decision, if we go against it, that decision will come anyway. These are just political realities. Of course, this power that he has does not match our fight inside of Alabama with the people we've organized. We'd already demonstrated that in Mississippi, when we went up against him in Mississippi and the people rejected him. So that was not the struggle. But the immediate struggle, again, was the struggle of the money and the projection of SNCC. Foreman's tactic, which was a tactic I disagreed with, was to fight SCLC tooth and nail to try and get the publicity that SNCC needed. John Lewis's position was not to do this, as it could not be. You must remember John Lewis came off of the SCLC Executive Committee to become chairman of SNCC. So you can see his close ties to SCLC and his total refusal to fight Dr. King on any issue. You can even go back to the march in Washington, where it was when King asked him to take out the words that he took out the words. So you can see here the contradictions that are developing. For us who decided that what we wanted to do was to organize an independent political party, since the march was going from Selma to Montgomery, and the only county between Selma and Montgomery was Lowndes County, this would work for us perfectly. King would mobilize forces in Lowndes County because we had very few contacts. Lowndes County had a population of close to 85% African, with not one registered voter. You must understand the terrorism of the county when you come to understand that this county bordered Montgomery, where King carried on his movement in 1957. And even though many of the people in Lowndes County participated in the Montgomery movement, they never transferred the Montgomery movement into Lowndes County, which is most unusual in the struggle. If you look at our struggle, many times people contacted one county would take it to another county. But even though many of those who came to join the Lowndes County Freedom Organization began after a while to share their experience with us, and even told them, even Mr. Hewlett was once a bodyguard in front of King's house in Montgomery. Okay. So you can see, what we did was, as King marched through there with all the enthusiasm, we collected this enthusiasm and built the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. So the Black Panther Party was built off of the mobilization that King sprouted out inside of Lowndes County, and he did us a perfect job. That's why Lowndes County was able to organize itself within 1 year and a half and cause all the contradictions it caused around the country.
Let's cut, please. Mark. Okay. Give me your feelings about the march and what you felt about the marches.
Okay, the march itself, I wasn't very enthusiastic about, clearly. So here, I was in total harmony with SNCC people. We were against the march. I, too, was against it. But again, I said it was a fait accompli. We couldn't stop it. King was going to have it, and there was no way to stop it. So all you had to do now is make a positive out of a negative. Consequently, I marched along with the marchers, but I wasn't considering myself part of the march. And what I did was, when it entered Lowndes County, I would seek out all the people from Lowndes County who came to the march. I would get them, write down their names, record it, their addresses, and tell them, listen, we're going to stay in Lowndes County. We're not just going to pass through. And they'd be excited to hear that. So while, and it said, most of the march stayed in Lowndes County, because Lowndes County is the only county between there and Montgomery County.
Why did you disagree with the march?
Because it would not serve any purpose. It's the same. Well, all right, it's back to Mississippi Greenwood, Mississippi again. You would come, mobilize the people, kick up a lot of dust, and then leave. Maybe a legislation would be passed, but there would be no organized force here even to take proper advantage of that legislation which was passed. So consequently, for me, the organizational power is still the only means to advance the people's struggle scientifically and properly, not the mobilization, only the organization. So consequently, since the march would not lead on behalf of the SCLC on any better organization, they were just going to mobilize and leave like everywhere else. Then for us, at least since they will kick up the dust, we who were going to be there would catch this dust and keep this dust to carry it on where we must go. So I was against the march completely for that reason. But there was nothing we could do. They were going to kick up the dust. So what I did was follow it, got the names, and from there we went on quickly and rapidly into Lowndes County.
Now, in Clay Carson's book, you're quoted saying that you were very bitter indifference that was shown toward in the nation in their response to, say, Jimmy Lee Jackson's death versus Reverend Reeves. Can you just talk to me about that?
Well, it's understood. It's the same thing that goes all the way back again to the '64 Summer Project, that when Schwerner and Goodman got killed, everybody forgot about Cheney. So once again, what it seemed to me is that the movement itself is playing into the hands of racism. Because what you want is the nation to be upset when anybody is killed, and especially when one of us is killed. You understand? So it just played into the hands of racism, and it's almost like, for this to be recognized, a white person must be killed. Well, what are you saying? I mean, we're dying. We died out of proportion to numbers, and yet even today, when people speak, they will tell you once again, Goodman and Schwerner. The names are recorded throughout. Yet Jimmy Lee Jackson, Herbert Lee, you understand, so many, many, many names are not even known. Even the names of the 3 children blown up in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, are not as well known as the names of Cheney and the name of Goodman and Schwerner. So here again, you're just playing into the hands of racism. So, of course, we're bitter. We're still bitter to this day about it, because it still means that our life is not worth, even in death, the life of anybody else. That their life is still more precious.
Okay. After Reed's death, President Johnson went on the air and made a speech for the Voting Rights Bill, and in conclusion he said, "We shall overcome," and used words quoting King and things. What did you feel about that time in the voting rights and just legislation?
It was clear hypocrisy, clearly, and not only that, it was for us, the nationalist forces, clear the failure of the non-nationalist forces. That is exactly what they wanted.
Tell me what is hypocrisy? You gotta tell
The
me.
hypocrisy of Johnson. Johnson's total hypocrisy. Johnson didn't want to do any of those things. He was forced to do all of it. And then having to do it, he did the least he could do and tried to make believe as if he was really doing something. So his singing, "We shall overcome," in hypocrisy, was most people in SNCC were not happy. Now, the non-nationalist forces, some and other organizations were happy, but most people in SNCC were not at all happy and saw the statement for the hypocritical statement that it was, especially since SNCC had already faced Johnson in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge. We had faced him, so we knew what he was. So when he now, who faced us and threw us filth after people had shed their blood to have full participation in the Democratic Party, would come back and sing, "We shall overcome," we felt like vomiting.
Okay.
And we were younger then too,
How much film you have up there? 0. Let's go. Go ahead.
The Vietnam conflict for the Student Nonviolent Going Committee and its militant position was decided long before they gave to the peace movement the slogan, "Hell no, we won't go." This decision started as a result of a racist congressman in areas where SNCC workers were working, trying to get us drafted. So you can understand how the struggle started long before Vietnam. For example, Eastland would find out that I was working in his district, and maybe that I was born in New York, or my draft was in New York, and consequently he would send a note to my draft board to draft me. So even from the time we were young, before the struggle started, we had to resist the draft in order to keep on fighting in the struggle. Well, obviously, it would be difficult for them to convince me, who was getting shot at in Mississippi for getting the right to vote, to go to Vietnam and shoot somebody to give somebody else the right to vote. Obviously, the logic here was too clear. We had no choice but to resist the draft, and not only to resist it, but to continue the struggle. So we had 2 objectives. The first objective, actually, was to continue the struggle while resisting the draft. So even before resisting the draft became a thing, inside of SNCC it started. Since 62, 63, we've been in this struggle. So once the Vietnam War was building, and obviously we had no intentions of going to fight to give the vote to anybody since we couldn't vote in Mississippi, you understand, there was no question here. This was already decided long before the militant aspect of, as we said, "Hell no, we won't go." And even if you will look, you will see that the peace movement itself, which SNCC was aligned to, had the slogan not of "Hell no, we won't go." They didn't want draft resistance. They wanted peace inside. They just wanted America to stop the war. That's what they wanted. But it was SNCC that wanted destruction of the draft. And the reason why we saw the reasons because they attacked us, and we began to see the draft, in fact, here as a political weapon against our struggle. So we had to go to destroy the draft. And throughout the struggle, you will see the militancy of SNCC. Wherever people speak for SNCC, they'll be going against the draft. As a matter of fact, some of the first arrests and some of the longest arrests SNCC faced, as a matter of fact, were around this draft with the Bob Stone and those others in Atlanta, where we went to destroy. And you will see the fight with Cleve Sellers going to jail. And at this time, they were really attacking us. And by the time we got ready, we said, okay, enough time playing with them. Just tell them, hell no, we won't go. And let's spread it out there. Of course, we were lucky because at this time, the Nation of Islam also had Muhammad Ali, who also was taking the same position. So you had, and of course we must be clear here, the Nation of Islam had always taken a position against the war in Vietnam, against going into the army. Honorable Elijah Muhammad went to jail in World War II, not because, like Bayard Rustin or others, that he was nonviolent or a pacifist, but because he simply said, I ain't going to fight the white man's army. That's all. So their tradition gave a strong boost to SNCC's fight now against the draft. So while they were not an activist group coming out to SNCC would to picket and to make demonstrations no matter what forms, at least their philosophical backing and their position of all their members not to be drafted was a strong backup to SNCC.
And what did, being in Mississippi in '64, what did the Civil Rights Bill in '64, what did it mean to those in Mississippi? What did it?
Well, in 1964, the passing of the Civil Rights Bill meant very little to people in Mississippi, again, because simply since early days they had decided the vote and political power was the way to begin to find a proper key to the solution of the problem. So the '64 bill was not even so strongly applauded or anything. It just passed, you know, just, oh, they passed a bill today, fine. Among the people, we're not talking about SNCC people, among the people, oh, they passed it. Among SNCC people, it probably wouldn't even be mentioned, you know.